And we're rolling. Hey, Matthew.
Hey, how you doing, Mark?
Good. How you doing? How's the UN these days?
It's all right. As we're doing this, it's almost 8 o'clock at night on Thursday, February 12th. Yes. There's been a meeting of the Security Council about the prospective indictment of the president of Sudan for war crimes. So it's just another day at the UN.
Big day, big news day. Mark Gold.
Last, certainly 2 weeks here at the UN, there's been bubbling under the surface, but I've been trying to pursue the issue of Sri Lanka, in which the government has taken it upon itself to make a sort of a final offensive on the Tamil Tiger rebels in the northern part. And there are hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in northern Sri Lanka. The UN has not called for any ceasefire. And the reason I was holding my tongue while you were talking is I guess it may seem like apples and oranges to you, but I wonder, where is the Enough Project in Sri Lanka, for example? Do you see what I mean? Because when you actually look, and I felt it may be terrible what's happening in Muhajiria. I think if you actually compare it to even what happened in northern Congo with the LRA, and I will say just apples to apples comparison, number of civilians being killed and put in harm's way by a government attack on rebels, it is much greater in Sri Lanka currently. And I'm watching both in real time, and it flabbergasts me. I mean, I hope we can engage on why it is that the UN hasn't dealt with Sri Lanka and why Ban Ki-moon didn't call for a ceasefire and a variety of things. But even the NGO community, I have to say, it's very troubling to me. I think that there's this, it's kind of like once you've invested yourself in saying there's genocide in Darfur, you have to keep the ball rolling. Even if you're talking about, in the case of Muhajiria, you're talking about, I don't know, 20 dead. I mean, my numbers may be wrong, and I'm open to saying I'm totally, have lost my, but I think it's less than 100, totally. And I think I'm not saying that that's nothing. I just am saying I would the Enough Project to compare the casualty levels in Darfur to Sri Lanka, and then explain why they've said nothing on this other topic.
Let me make one quick point about Muhajiria. One of the points I wanted to make but didn't was I think part of the reason there were so few casualties in Muhajiria, and there weren't no casualties
because of the Enough Project.
Well, no, was because frankly, was because there was attention paid to what was happening there. Part of that was sort of activist grassroots pressure, and that presumably leaked up to Susan Rice, who had a pretty harsh statement and named Muhajiria by name, and like you said, there was all this activity going on at the Security Council. And there was all this activity going on around at the Security Council around the situation that was unfolding.
But the reason I don't take the concern with humanitarians of either the U.S. government or of the Enough Project seriously, because you have a greater number of civilians at risk by a government attack on rebels in Sri Lanka, and they didn't raise it. They're not raising it. I've spoken to the P5 ambassadors about the country, and they're, for whatever reason, and so it makes me, I think this just plays into the hands of those who say the micromanaging and the focus of this one admitted humanitarian disaster at this time is more political than humanitarian or objective, international law of the problems of humanitarianism. Of course, and every time you could say, well, the numbers were small because of our involvement. But okay, now when is the involvement going to focus on a country that's not? I don't know. I'm not a defender of Sudan. I think they're terrible. But I literally, in real time, having spent the last 10 days asking Ban Ki-moon, asking UK Ambassador John Soares why Sri Lanka isn't on the Security Council agenda, or why they haven't asked for it, or why they haven't even. Literally, here's the two differences. In the case of Muhajiria, the call from the Security Council and the Secretariat was, Sudan, don't go in. And the idea was, and it's one that I probably agree with, where civilians are at play, a government should stay its hand from attacking a rebel-held area. But I just don't understand, if that's the principle, why doesn't it apply in this other conflict? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It doesn't. I mean, I'm not walking around looking for hypocrisy, but Ban Ki-moon asked point blank, why are you calling for a ceasefire in Sri Lanka? Said, no, I'm not, because it's not on the Security Council's agenda. And also, what he called for was just that the attack on the rebels comply with international humanitarian law. But that's very different than, my question is there a right of a sitting government to attack rebel-held positions in a way that might harm civilians? I don't know what the answer is, but I know that whatever the answer is has to apply in both cases. Unless you just say, we don't like the government of Sudan and we like the government of Sri Lanka. So when they kill civilians while they're chasing rebels, we're going to look the other way. But in this other case, we're going to count every single one. We're going to issue a presidential statement. We're going to rev up the NGO community. We're going to indict the president. I mean, I don't know.
Well, let me sort of try to respond to your points by sort of telling you how I came to sort of understand and sort of get up to date on the Sri Lanka issue was probably about 6 weeks ago, right, when the current government offensive really started revving up. Mm-hmm. I don't follow Sri Lanka per se, but I do follow the UN, and I noticed, I guess in one of my Google searches or whatever, that Navi Pillay, the new Commissioner for Human Rights, issued a statement condemning a certain practice, a government practice, in fact, in the northern region where the fighting was occurring, and apparently sort of coupled with the government offensive against the Tamil Tigers, there was a mass exodus of civilians in the north who were trying to rightly escape this fighting, and civilians were being killed and harmed by both sides. But as the civilians were leaving, according to the High Commission on Human Rights, they were sort of summarily arrested. Mm-hmm. And they were put into these detention centers, kind of like an extra judicial. Yeah, they're well. There's almost hundreds of thousands, I believe, were put into these sort of temporary camps and not allowed to sort of be internally displaced people as protected under international law, but were instead sort of pseudo-arrested and held in these detention facilities.
And if that were done in Sudan,
to answer your question, the High Commissioner on Human Rights was condemning that practice.
But don't you think if it happened in Sudan, it wouldn't be one press release by Navi Pillay that had zero effect, right? It would be the Security Council would call an emergency meeting. You'd have CNN and BBC.
Again, I've seen I don't. You seem to think that they're not bearing this issue. I know about this issue because they're drawing attention to it. Because I read a World Food Program release saying that their convoys are being disrupted. I read another statement by Navi Pillay saying that how appalling it was that journalists were being barred from this northern Vanni region.
Oh, journalists are being killed in Sri Lanka. They bombed a TV station in the middle of Colombo, and yes, I'm sure that UNESCO put out some half-assed press release. But what I'm saying is that the UN is like the Secretary General and the Security Council. I mean, maybe you may be one of the few people, I had copped to being it as well, that actually is on the mailing list of Navi Pillay and the UNESCO guy. But I'm telling you, the bully pulpit, to the degree the UN has one, has decidedly not been used for this purpose. Decidedly, and in fact, it's considered a kind of, and again, this is actually one that really, it flabbergasts me, and things are much worse. I don't want to just burn, Ban Ki-moon was asked point blank, that's all I can say, is he calling for a ceasefire? And in every other case like this, including Gaza, in which an attack, and I use Gaza because the allegation is that Israel was fighting a terrorist group, right? But even fighting a terrorist group, you can't kill civilians. But what's being allowed to happen in Sri Lanka, and I think, God bless Navi Pillay, but the approach, here's what I want to say. At the same time that you saw that press release by Navi Pillay, the senior advisor to the president of Sri Lanka, who's actually the president's brother, came and met with Mr. Ban. And there was no readout of the meeting. There was no talk about it. And it's become clear to me that the purpose of this meeting was for the government of Sri Lanka to say to Ban Ki-moon, we're doing it. We're almost finished. This is the final solution. That's a bad phrase to use. This is it. Just give us a little time, and don't you dare call for a ceasefire, because we can really end it. And if you call for a ceasefire, you're just letting the Tigers survive. And I think that the UN said, okay, just do it as well as you can, do it as quick as you can, because it's amazed everyone here, including journalists that don't give a damn about Sri Lanka. They couldn't believe that when he was asked, are you calling for a ceasefire, that he pulled out a piece of paper and read a legal position, that it is his position that he can't call for a ceasefire if an item is not on the agenda of the Security Council. And minutes later, because this is why I love it here, I ran in front of the Security Council, and there was the president of the Security Council, the Japanese ambassador, Takasu, and asked him if that's the law. And he said that's not the law. Article 99 of the UN puts it directly on the Secretary General to do what he thinks is right on this type of a situation. And so it's sort of, again, I don't want to, there's Ban Ki-moon. And so I guess what I want to say is you've seen these, what I want to characterize as relatively obscure and well-meaning. I sometimes think, I see how it works here. If you ask a kind of a question that the UN doesn't want to wade into, they'll say, oh, but Navi Pillay said something. It's almost like the outsourcing of inconvenient problems, Like, for example, in Somalia.
I don't know. She's like the head human rights official, and she had sort of a statement about human rights. That's kind of and sort of human rights violations in Sri Lanka. That's sort of how